Welcome, everyone. I am Adeshewa Josh, and this is Africa Matters. This week, we look at the impact Russia's assault on Ukraine is having across Africa, something that's being compounded by COVID-19, climate change, conflict, and soaring prices of food, fuel, and fertilizers. We'll also head to South Africa, where census workers are conducting a once-in-a-decade national count. But for the first time, they're doing it digitally. And then we'll visit Nigeria, where landlords demanding a year's rent upfront are pricing tenants out of their homes. Luckily, lawmakers are working to change that. Many African countries are feeling the effects of Russia's ongoing attacks on Ukraine. Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa, three of the continent's largest economies, are grappling with rising food costs and surging fuel prices caused by disruptions in global supply chains. Egypt's inflation rate has risen from 4.9% 1 year ago to 10% in February, due in part to skyrocketing food prices, specifically vegetables, bread, and wheat. The price of unsubsidized bread, which more than 30 million Egyptians depend on, is nearly up by 50%, prompting the government to suspend wheat exports for the next 6 months. In South Africa, people are paying almost $2 per liter for petrol, an increase of more than 100 over the last decade, while in Nigeria, diesel has increased by 300% in just the last few weeks, which for some people has made the cost of living and the cost of doing business almost unaffordable.
Diesel forms a huge part of our operation expense. Now, you see, it's more than tripled. It's gone from 250 to 680, so it's a lot on our side. And then you find also that the national grid power has not been very stable for a very long time. So we're forced to use diesel. And it's not a good time for business.
Sudan, already dealing with the economic fallout of October's military coup, this week saw the price of a small loaf of bread nearly double from 5 to 8 US cents. That increase, along with rising costs of transportation, spurred people into action. And on Monday, thousands joined marches in cities across Sudan to protest both their military leaders and the rising cost of basic goods. The Sudanese pound has lost about a third of its value in the last month, and people everywhere are finding it difficult to make ends meet. And the Horn of Africa is currently experiencing a drought that's putting millions of people on the brink of starvation. The World Food Programme says the Russia-Ukraine conflict is not only affecting food prices, but is also crippling the distribution of humanitarian aid. That's because the UN agency relies on Ukraine for more than 50% of its aid supplies. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says this could spell disaster for many at a time when 44 million people in 38 countries are on the edge of famine.
This war goes far beyond Ukraine. It is also an assault on the world's most vulnerable people and countries. While war reigns over Ukraine, a sword of Damocles hangs over the global economy, especially in the developing world. Even before the conflict, developing countries were struggling to recover from the pandemic with record inflation, rising interest rates, and looming debt burdens. Their ability to respond has been erased by exponential increases in the cost of financing. Now, their breadbasket is being bombed. We must do everything possible to avert a hurricane of hunger and the meltdown of the global food system.
Let's hear more from Ovigwe Eguegu, a policy advisor at Development Reimagined. He joins me now from Abuja. Thank you so much for joining us. We are seeing the price of basic commodities like bread and cooking oil go up. How else and to what extent will the Ukraine-Russia conflict impact African countries and their economies? And is there still room to mitigate the fallout of this conflict?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So one of the main concerns with the outbreak of the conflict really was on commodity prices. The content's a bit split because for some economies, like Nigeria, Angola, who are oil exporters, for them it seemed like this would be time to get extra cash because of the increase in oil prices. But at the same time, Africa countries dependent, several countries are dependent on Russia and Ukraine for instance, for wheat. So Egypt, for instance, gets 85% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine. Somalia, in particular, becomes very vulnerable because of the high wheat prices, given that there's a drought currently, in the country, and it's also very dependent on import of wheat to make bread and pastries. I mean, East Africa as a whole gets 90% of its wheat, from this country. So there's a real concern that if the war does not stop anytime soon, or we don't find a way to get alternative supplies, there's a real risk of of hunger and a lot of social unrest because of the high prices of particularly of wheat, because wheat is a staple in many African countries.
Analysts are warning that rising food prices will trigger unrest like it did with the Arab Spring just over a decade ago. What is the likely political fallout?
It is, a good example would be Sudan. If you recall, the Sudan protest started in 2019 that led to the ousting of President Omar al-Bashir. 30-year collapse in a period of about 2 years. If you remember, that particular protest was fueled by two things in particular: increase in price of wheat and bread, and also an increase in petrol prices because the government cut subsidies. So and there are other parts of the continent where you can see a direct correlation between increase in very essential and basic goods like petrol and wheat, and then that leading to social unrest and then protest, and then all the other issues that of course and grievances that people are already feeling that becomes takes center stage. So it is very concerning for many fragile countries and governments who know that their people are barely hanging by the thread, looking at this war, and looking at the knock-on effect on their economy, on price of wheat and fuel and very basic goods. And then there's a real concern that we might begin to see social unrest increase. But again, I think that goes a long way to show why African countries need to build some local capacity for these particular for this essential product, because that is really how you protect your economies and shield it from shocks in the global and international environment.
I think this is a good segue to my last question, which is, you rightly mentioned building capacity. Africa moving away from being excessively food dependent. How can we become food secure and independent in the long run?
Yeah, so food security for Africa, in my opinion, is going to be one of the most pressing issue on the continent going forward, because today we're about 1.2 billion people. By 2050, it's estimated that Africa will be about 2.4 billion people. 2050 is less than 30 years from today, and that shows you how urgent. It means whatever agricultural practices agricultural land area that we're currently using, we will need to perhaps even triple what we're currently using for us to be able to catch up with the local demand. And if you compare that with, or contrast that with the fact that many African countries are actually struggling to get the reserves and currency, the dollar, to actually import as it is now, if they don't make real economic progress, they might not even get enough. They might have serious inflation because they can't even get enough dollars to actually import many of the things like wheat that they need to meet needs. So I think there is a strong need for a very comprehensive agricultural development policy across the continent that really securitizes, quote unquote, food self-sufficiency across the continent. Whether at the AU level, at the REC level, we need to start building very serious and strong partnerships to tap into agricultural land. For instance, Nigeria has 60% of its land area is arable, and we're not even using anywhere near half of that currently. So the potential is huge to be able to continue to produce food and meet the demand. The problem is lack of investment, lack of planning and foresight, and also really lack of the risks, the awareness of the risks rather that we really face. Because if our governments are really aware of the risks, then they will definitely tighten their belt and get to work to see how we can actually improve the food self-sufficiency of the continent.
Well, it's good to hear that it is actually possible. Thank you so much. Ovigwe Eguegu, Policy Advisor at Development Reimagined. Thank you. We have more stories coming up for you here on Africa Matters Plus.
I'm Nsepeng Mutema, and I'll tell you how Statistics South Africa is taking advantage of the growth of internet users in the country and is conducting its first ever digital census count to measure the population.
I'm Jack Mangut in Abuja, and I'm reporting on how some lawmakers in Nigeria are seeking to change how tenants in the capital pay their rent.
We head to Somalia now, where a severe drought is pushing the country into a humanitarian crisis. According to the United Nations, the Horn of Africa region is facing its driest conditions in more than 4 decades, and the country's much-needed aid is dwindling due to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Shoaib Hassan has the story.
Forced out of her home into a camp in southern Somalia, Habiba Mao Iman is fleeing a terrible drought. It hasn't rained in 2 years. Her animals have died and her crops have failed.
No one is helping us. We have no food, we have no water, we even have no clothes and no plastic sheet for shelter. We fled from drought, and I have been here for 158 days with no food and shelter for the children. Every day I go out and knock on houses in town to beg so that my children can eat.
Abdullahi Abdul Muhammad is among tens of thousands of people seeking aid in the same camp. He says when he arrived, the camp was in the grip of a measles epidemic.
I'm from the countryside. I was a farmer in Dinsur, and I traveled on a donkey cart for 6 days just to get away. My son has measles and is malnourished. I also left my wife and 2 other kids who have measles in the camp. I lost one daughter. She died of measles in the IDP camp.
The ongoing conflict in Ukraine is also affecting Somalia's food security. The country imports most of its wheat from Egypt, which relies heavily on Russia and Ukraine. Humanitarian organizations say the situation is likely to get worse.
The food security situation is so poor. Those people have lost everything behind them, that is livestock or agriculture, and they came completely in need of food, shelter, water, health care, everything they want. Majority of them are women and children.
Somalia has experienced a series of catastrophic droughts in the last decade. Iman and Mohammed hope this one too will soon pass. Shoaib Hassan, Africa Matters.
Russia's incursion into Ukraine has impacted the global economy, raising the price of food staples the world over. Ghana, already suffering economically, is now faced with soaring wheat prices. As a result, many businesses in the country are at risk of closing their doors for good. Taibe Aydin has more.
Bethel Brothers Bakery in Ghana's capital, Accra, has been making bread for about 25 years. It was founded by childhood friends Raphael and David, but their joint venture may come to an end soon due to soaring inflation in the country.
Really, the whole thing started from last year, June coming. Every month they will increase flour, not just flour, sugar, margarine, all things that we need to produce bread have been increased, some on monthly or weekly basis, and it's really affecting the bakery industry.
Every day, the bakery churns out hundreds of loaves for households, restaurants and street vendors. It also employs people from different backgrounds and some casual workers who want to make some extra money.
I have a whole lot of professionals who they just came here working, getting their weekly wages or salary, and they are helped them to be able to upgrade themselves in school. I have a lot. I have about 6 or 7 here that they are here working while they are going to school. They are here working whilst they are going to school, and this place have helped them, and they will be able to improve upon their life. So if all of a sudden this inflation or what is going on should make us to fold, then you should know what it has cost.
The COVID-19 pandemic and a depreciating national currency has wreaked havoc on Ghana's economy. The inflation rate has reached a 5-year high of 15.7%, forcing core ingredients to cost much more. But bakeries can't pass that on to customers because bread prices are standardized by the National Bakers Union, and it hasn't allowed a rise in the past 8 months. Moscow's attack on Ukraine has been the last straw as the country imports almost a quarter of its wheat from Russia. To stay afloat, some bakers have reduced portion sizes or illegally marked up prices. The Bethel brothers were forced to lay off some staff to cope with the rising prices.
When they increase the products, the material that you use to bake, you also have to decrease the size of the bread. And the moment you decrease it or you try to increase it, then it becomes a problem. It becomes something, okay, if you have increased it, I'm not going to take it.
The Bethel brothers continue waking up before dawn to bake their bread in their wood fire oven. They just hope the heat of inflation won't eventually extinguish their business. Taiba Aiden, Africa Matters.
We go to South Africa next, where census workers are hoping cutting-edge technology will help the government gather more reliable demographic data. This is the 4th population census since the dawn of democracy, but the first time the country is using a digital system to capture figures in the field. Accurate, reliable data is a key factor in developing social policies that impact both the public and private sectors. Nsepeng Motema reports from Pretoria.
Armed with smart tablets, field workers from Statistics South Africa set out in Hammanskraal Township. They are part of a nationwide team tasked with counting exactly how many people live within the nation's borders. And it's the first time the country is collecting population and housing census data digitally. Next up is the household of Lina Mapai. The 65-year-old is delighted to answer the census questionnaire.
We are glad they have come. Maybe by talking to them, the government will come to our community and see the conditions we live under. That way we will know that we are not just invisible, that the government knows about us.
Some of the questions Mapai had to answer include how many people live in her home and if they are working, as well as details like access to water and internet connectivity. This information used to be taken down on paper, followed by a long, difficult process of trying to accurately decipher thousands of different handwriting styles that had been collected in the field. As a result, by the Census Bureau's own estimates, the last 3 national population measures in 1996, 2001 and 2011 undercounted by 14%. This affects policy formulation. Data collected is used to help the government plan better when making budget allocations. Previously, the work of tabulating the information recorded by hand would take up to 2 years. The Statistician General leading the new initiative says they plan to release the results within 12 months.
The benefit is that you don't have a lot of supervision that has to be done in the field, because once the information is captured, it's sent to our central database. So you have a team of people who will be looking at data consistency and other things of data cleaning from a central point instead of having them out there in the field.
In addition to introducing digital collection technology, 2 new ways of gathering information have also been added due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Respondents wishing to avoid face-to-face contact with census takers can opt to be counted online or over the phone. This will also help address the issues of accessibility that have contributed to miscounting in the past. Statistics South Africa has historically struggled to gain access to people living in gated communities, on large farms, and in hard-to-reach rural areas. People hope the use of technology will make the population count more accurate, and they are eager to see the government act on it in order to adequately address key issues the country has been struggling to manage, such as the unequal access to quality health care, education, and employment. Nsepeng Motema, Africa Matters, Pretoria.
You're watching Africa Matters, and here's a roundup of other stories making news across the continent. Washington says it has expanded its visa restrictions to even more Somalis, but still hasn't released specific names. It happened after the country once again failed to hold parliamentary elections on time. Only 3 of the country's 5 states selected their representatives by Tuesday's deadline. The president is chosen by 2 chambers of parliament, and the voting cannot take place until representatives from both are elected and sworn in. Elections have now been delayed for more than a year. Francis Kere from Burkina Faso has become the first African to win the Pritzker Prize, architecture's most prestigious award. His designs are made from local clay and cement, to which helps keep buildings cool in hot environments. A wide raised metal roof protects the building from rain and helps airflow. Kere has built schools, health centers, family dwellings, and other public spaces across Africa. We go to Nigeria next, where lawmakers are seeking to stop landlords in the country's capital, Abuja, from demanding that tenants pay a year's worth of rent in advance. Currently, most tenants in Nigeria pay rent 12 months upfront and in some cases 2 years in advance. Ajak Mangut reports.
34-year-old Hassan Ibrahim lives in this single-room apartment with his wife and 3 kids. Hassan says he had to rent this small place because he could not afford to raise around $1,500 all at once to rent a bigger house.
Any money I make in a month, I have to save a chunk of it just for rent. But if I was to pay in bits, it would allow me to take care of other needs and probably move to a bigger place.
Nigeria's capital is home to more than 4 million people. Officials say 2 million more apartments are needed to make up for its housing deficit. Because of the shortage, landlords can charge higher prices and demand rent a year in advance. Around 50% of all residents have to save more than half of their annual income to pay their rent yearly. Lawmakers are hoping to change that with new legislation that will allow tenants to pay rent in advance of just 3 months and subsequently on a monthly payment schedule.
Most of the people are salary income earners. And some of them, even if you take their 3 years salary, they cannot pay the money required for advance payment. And because of that, I believe the best way to treat the people is to ask them to pay monthly.
Kabiru Abdullahi is a property developer and estate manager in Abuja. He says the bill is not sustainable and it's not favorable to landlords who need rent upfront so the money can be used to build more apartments.
What the lawmakers are trying to do is will only favor the tenants, but in the other hand, it will not favor the landlords, because the landlord, they are spending a lot of money to build house. And meanwhile, they are complaining even they want 1 year. Some of them, they are requesting for 2 years. If the landlord, they will agree with their tenants to feel like 6 months tenancy. If that one expire, then they pay another one before they finish. So I think that one will bring solution.
Some construction experts say the government should discourage the use of imported raw materials to lower the high cost of building houses that will in turn make it cheaper for people to rent or buy their own homes.
The bill is still in its early phase. It has passed a second reading in the Senate and will now be sent to a committee for public hearings. When that has been completed, it will still have to go through at least 3 more stages in Parliament before it becomes law.
If the legislation is passed, hundreds of thousands of low-income earners will be able to pay their rent with a little more ease. But for now, Abuja residents like Hassan will have to continue paying a year in advance. Ajak Mangut, Africa Matters, Abuja.
And this week we explore Palime, a city in the plateau region of Togo in West Africa. It's about 15 kilometers from the Guinean border and serves as a starting point for tourists with its rich natural region of lush plateaus. Let's take a look. That's our show this week. Please share your thoughts and suggestions about the stories you've seen on this episode or ideas you would like us to cover on Twitter using the hashtag #AfricaMatters. Feel free to reach out to me on my personal handle @AdeshewaJosh. Remember, you can watch this episode and more on YouTube. Just search Africa Matters. Like, comment, and share. We will leave you with these images from across the continent.